First Kings chapter 18 is where we're going to be picking up this evening. We're looking at Elijah and his, what some have called the showdown on the mountain with the 450 prophets of Baal. And one of the most famous interactions in the Old Testament, especially a story that has been told many times through VBSs and things along those lines. But we want to look at it as we find it in the progression of our study through the Kings. And so we were introduced to Elijah in the last chapter. Of course, last week we did not have class. The stomach bug hit our house, and so there was no way for me to produce class. And so we had a 1 week break. But a couple of weeks previous, we looked in chapter 17 and we saw how Elijah came on the scene from nowhere. But really, Elijah is not the main focus, even though literary speaking, from the literary style, he is the main focus. That is, he becomes the central figure. How he and Ahab and their exchanges with one another become central. But even above all of that, God remains the central figure of all of Scripture, right? And so as they're going through this, we saw last week how God is exalting himself above the perceived Baal. And in this chapter, we see that come to fruition, and he's going to continue to exalt himself in a very public way to turn the hearts of Israel back toward him. And so as we think about this particular chapter, let's begin in verse 1. It says, after many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So in the 3rd year of the drought. Now, when you look at James 5 and verse 17, James writes and says that it did not rain upon the earth for 3 years and 6 months. And so there are a couple of questions that people have raised concerning how do these two verses work together? Because if they're not read carefully, you could almost see in some people's minds a disagreement between the two, but there's not really a disagreement. There are a couple possibilities here. Number one is that James is using what is called a broken 7. And so 7 is the number of completeness, and you'll see this in apocalyptic literature a lot. And so to indicate incomplete times, if 7 is complete, then incomplete can be sometimes called a broken 7. That is, you cut 7 in half and you get 3.5. And so some people think that's what James is doing. But for me, when I look at this, it says that the word of the Lord came to him in the 3rd year. Okay, so in the 3rd year, depending on how you calculate that, that could certainly explain the span of the additional 6 months on top of that 3rd year. Either way, it's certainly not a contradiction, but it is something to think through. There have been 3 long years without rain. And in an agricultural society, that is an absolute death knell. As we talked about last week, the economy would go into the tank, and of course, people would struggle. It's not like modern day where we can send food across the places and humanitarian aid. That's not the way things operated then. And so now God has decided that rain is going to return. And so in verse 2, it says, so Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, of course, the capital of the 10 northern tribes. And then it says in verse 3, and Ahab called Obadiah, who was over his household, or over the household, which he's kind of like Joseph was over Potiphar's household, say in Genesis 39, or over the prison, or in some ways somewhat similar to what Joseph was for Pharaoh, as he oversaw the administration of the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And so it could be that that's what he's comparative to. But certainly one that ran the household, a very high-ranking official. Then we're given this parenthetical statement about Obadiah. It says, now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, which is interesting because Ahab and his wife Jezebel have completely abandoned God and gone after the god Baal. And so he fears the Lord greatly, but yet he serves in Ahab's administration. And so it says, when Jezebel had cut off the prophets of the Lord, that is, she had killed them, and this will come up again in verse 13, she had gone through a process of purging all the prophets of God from the land of Israel. It says that Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water. And so she's slaughtering all the prophets. And that tells you, by the way, that we're only given a small sampling in the Old Testament of the amount of prophets that there were. Okay, she slaughters all the prophets, and Obadiah saves only 100, which gives you the idea that that's a pretty small proportion of what the greater number was. And so it's more, there were far more prophets that we will never know their names, that never wrote a book, that were never enshrined in scripture, so to speak. And so either way, Obadiah is saving these prophets, and he hides them in a cave. Now, on Mount Carmel, which will become central a little bit later in this chapter, it's known that there were at least 2,000 caves on that mountain alone. And so when you look at Amos chapter 9, there's mention made to the hiding of Carmel. Or you think about the language of Hebrews 11:32-38, about them hiding in caves or dens in the earth. Similar to what could be said here, and maybe what the writer of Hebrews is talking about, of course, in a more broad term, not just this specific instance, but even other instances as well. And so he feeds them with bread and water. Now that's interesting, because this is a time of famine when not many people have bread and water. But of course, he, as an administrator over Pharaoh's house, or over Ahab's house, would have access to more than the common people. And so he was in a position to take care of them. And so he was able to do that without drawing attention to himself, which is quite a feat. Now, we're given that information to help us understand the exchange that now takes place. And Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land into all the springs of water, into the valleys. Perhaps we may find grass and save the horses and mules alive and not lose some of the animals." So they divided the land between them to pass through it. Ahab went in one direction by himself, and Obadiah went in another direction by himself. And so they go out and split the land. Ahab goes one way, Obadiah goes the other, and they're in search of water. They're in search of grass in order to keep the animals alive. Now that's interesting, because it seems as if Ahab, obviously Jezebel, killing the prophets of the Lord, they're more concerned with keeping their animals alive than they are keeping human beings alive. And we know that he had quite a bit of horses. There are some memoirs of a king that entered into battle, and Ahab is said to have donated 2,000 chariots or given 2,000 chariots to that battle effort. Now, if you have just 2 horses per chariot, most likely 3, based upon how they were constructed, then you're looking at several thousand horses and mules, and those are just things that he would loan out, that he certainly wouldn't have given away all of them. And so he's got thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these animals that he's trying to take care of. So we're not talking about small portions. We're talking about massive proportions of things. And so they go in their different directions. Now, as they go in their different directions, verse 7, and as Obadiah was on the way, behold, Elijah met him. So Elijah is returning, of course. He has been with the widow in Zarephath, in that northern Phoenician area, just north of the nation of Israel, of course, where Jezebel was from, hiding in her homeland, and yet she could not be found, or he could not be found. And Obadiah recognized him, that is Elijah, and fell on his face and said, "Is it you, my lord Elijah?" And he answered him, "It is I. Go tell your lord, behold, Elijah is here." And he said, "How have I sinned that you would give your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? And as the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my Lord has not sent to seek you. And when they would say he is not here, he would take an oath of that kingdom or nation that they had not found you. And now you say, go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here. And as soon as I have gone from you, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you, I know not where. And so I will come and tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, and he will kill me, although I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth." Now that's a longer discussion, or a longer statement by Obadiah, but he's basically telling Elijah, "You want me to go tell him you're here? That's a death wish. I will go and tell him you're here, and then God will direct you to go somewhere else, and then you won't be found, and then he'll kill me because he's mad at me." And he said, I've been faithful to God. I don't have a death wish here. And then he makes mention of the fact that Ahab has spent all of these years looking for Elijah. "There's no nation or kingdom where my Lord has not sent to seek you." These extradition treaties, where if you're harboring a fugitive, you will hand him over to me. And nations to this day still do that, extradition treaties and things along that line. And so he's been looking for him extensively, wanting Elijah dead. And we'll have more to say about that here in just a little bit when Ahab and Elijah meet again. So in verse 13, Obadiah continues his speech and says, "Has it not been told, my Lord, what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord? How I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water? And now you say, go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here, and he will kill me. And Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. So Obadiah went to Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. And so Elijah puts him at rest and says, no, I'm not going anywhere. Of course, we know from the narrative, with it being completed and us standing on the outside looking in, that God has sent Elijah to this specific place for this specific purpose. Now, Obadiah does not know that as the events are unfolding. So now Ahab and Elijah meet again. Remember, the last time they met, chapter 17 and verse 1, was when Elijah said, as the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. So now they meet again, verse 17. And Ahab saw Elijah. Ahab said to him, is it you, you troubler of Israel? Interesting. So much to unpack here. So many different things that could be said. First of all, you troubler. A similar incident, and many people, when you look at certain people's writings, they see a very close connection between this and Joshua chapter 7. You remember Achan was the one who took of the accursed things of Jericho and caused some men to be killed at the battle of Ai when they were first taking the promised land. And it was said in Joshua 7:25 that he had brought trouble to Israel. And thus they had to stone him and his family and remove that trouble from Israel. Now, when Ahab calls Elijah the troubler of Israel, it's so interesting of the human condition to be able to look at someone else and say, it's your fault. Now, Ahab has launched a nation and just put it headlong into not just calf worship like Jeroboam did, but now foreign god worship and Baal, and can look at Elijah and honestly say, you're the reason this happened. Because Elijah looked at him and said, because of your idolatry, it's not going to rain anymore. God is going to send a famine on the land. But somehow it becomes the messenger's fault rather than the individual who has done what was wrong. And this is what Elijah says to him, and rightly so. And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have in your father's house, because you abandoned the commandment of the Lord and followed the Baals. It's not my fault, it's your fault. And so many times what happens is, to make us feel better about our sinful behavior, it's easier to accuse the person who points out our sinful behavior that it's their fault that this is happening. It's their fault that things have gone down the way that they are, rather than looking at ourselves and saying, you know what? No, they just pronounced things as they were. They just called things as they were. And now I'm having to pay the penalty for the sins that I've committed or for the behaviors that I've engaged in. It's not their fault, it's mine. So now Elijah says, now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So he suggests a showdown. Let's enter into a competition, so to speak, on Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Carmel is about 17 miles northwest of Jezreel. If you look on a map of Israel, you know, the Mediterranean Sea runs along this coast. There's like a little thumb, like juts out into the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea, and that's Mount Carmel. And it had limestone and flintstone all throughout it, 1,724 feet high, and on occasions had served kind of as a border between Israel and Phoenicia, depending upon which period of history you were in. Obviously not according to the promised land drawings that God had for his people when they took the promised land, but on other occasions that was certainly the case. So now in verse 20, it says, so Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Carmel was significant. As we're going to see later, there had been an altar there to make offerings to God, the God of Israel, to Yahweh. But it had more recently, obviously, become a central location for the worship of Baal. And so when Elijah is suggesting they go to Mount Carmel, he's in essence saying, I'll give you home field advantage. Okay, showdown. We'll do it at your house. This place where Baal is worshipped, we'll do it there. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. And so Elijah is showing them, you need to make a choice. Are you going to serve Baal or are you going to serve God? You can't keep limping or trying to go between these two opinions. Same thing Jesus would say in Matthew 6:24. You can't serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll hold to the one and despise the other. You can't serve God and mammon. You can't have them both. But the people don't answer him a word. They refuse to make the decision. Then Elijah said to the people, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now, the prophets of Asherah do not show up for this showdown. That's pretty clear based upon the rest of the verses in this text. And so it could be that they're with Jezebel and they don't get to come. But for whatever reason, they're not there. This is just the prophets of Baal and Elijah. Now, it's also interesting that he says, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord. Now, either he's protecting the 100 prophets who are being hidden by Obadiah by not mentioning them, or we may see some insight into some things that are going to happen in chapter 19, where he's already kind of getting this complex, like he's the only one trying to do it. And that will really get him in chapter 19. He'll think he's the only one left, that there are other people. Everybody has gone after idolatry, and we can kind of get this. And it happens today still when people who serve God, they can get this notion that somehow they're the only ones left. No one else is trying. I'm the last person who cares about this. And it's an extremely self-centered approach to things. We consider it to be a righteous approach, but it's actually quite self-centered. And so it could be that there may be some early hints of that attitude that's going to display itself in chapter 19. It says now in verse 23, let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves and cut it in pieces and lay it on wood, but put no fire on it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on wood and put no fire on it. You call on the name of your God, I'll call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he's God. And so Elijah sets the parameters and says, because, okay, you got home field advantage. Mount Carmel, you say that's a chief place to worship Baal. Baal was also supposedly responsible for lightning, for fire from the heavens. So this should be an absolute no-brainer. If Baal is who he says he is, he should answer on his home turf, and he should be willing to answer by fire on his home turf without a problem. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to put our sacrifices up, no fire. We're going to call out to our God, and this is how we determine who wins. The God who answers by fire, he's the God. He's the true God. And all the people answered, it is well spoken. Everyone agreed to the terms. Verse 25, then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourselves 1 bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. And they took the bull that was given to them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, several hours. And they were saying, oh, Baal, answer us. But there was no voice. No one answered. So for the first few hours, they're just constantly crying out to God, Baal, answer us, Baal, answer us. Of course, they're crying out to nothing. Baal does not exist. So after he won't answer, it says, then they limped around the altar that they had made, these ritualistic dances to try and draw his attention. And at noon, verse 27, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he's a God. Maybe you're just not talking loud enough. You're not getting his attention. Now, he's using sarcasm in this particular occasion, because sarcasm is overused. There's no question about that. But sarcasm can be effective when used correctly and rarely. Okay. And so what he's using sarcasm for here is to show just how ridiculous it is to believe in a God like Baal. So he's a God. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe he's that kind of God. Either he is musing. Maybe he's just mulling things over and thinking things through somewhere. Or he's relieving himself. He's gone to the bathroom. Or he's on a journey, as he was said to take according to some of his writings, some to fulfill sexual appetites, some to do different things throughout. Or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. You remember we talked about a couple of weeks ago that in between the early and the latter rains, he was supposedly put to death by Mot, the god of death, and then had to be resurrected. So maybe he's in one of those dead cycles, is what Elijah is saying. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. They're cutting their wrists. They're cutting in different places. This is why the law will many times in the Old Testament speak of not making cuttings upon your body for the dead or for other reasons, like Leviticus 21 and verse 5, because they're trying to appease their gods. If their gods see them in anguish and pain, maybe they will answer them. And it's also a way of manipulation. Maybe we can get him to some way have pity on us and answer us, to give us what we want, which is the answer in this particular occasion. Now, verse 29, and as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. It's interesting, the emphasis that the writer gives to silence. Okay, if you back up, it says in verse 26, no voice, no one answered. Verse 29, no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. He's honing in on the silence of Baal. It'd be similar to say there was no answer, nothing, zippity doo-dah, absolutely nothing. Just constantly driving home that point. So now Elijah is going to take his turn after Baal has proven to be completely impotent. He has no power to do anything. Then Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. And the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Apparently there was an altar there where people would offer sacrifices to God. And so he repairs it. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 25 says the altar could not be built out of hewn stone. It had to be natural stones, no cuttings. And Elijah took 12 stones, which was the way they would many times build their altars, according to Exodus 24 and verse 4, representing, of course, the 12 tribes of Israel. According to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. So roughly 3.5 gallons, as some people have guesstimated it. He builds the trench around it that would hold roughly 3.5 gallons of, in this instance, water when he fills it up. It says, so he put the wood in order, and then he cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. Now people say, they're in a drought. How could they get the water? Well, if they're at Mount Carmel, the Mediterranean is right there. He's not saying it has to be drinkable water. He's just saying get water. And so he takes these 4 jars and he douses everything in water. And he says, do it a second time, 34. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. So obviously, it's going to be hard. Why he is putting water on the altar and on the offering and everything there, and then filling the 3.5 gallon trench around it, everything's going to flow over and come down and catch there. He's proven that there is no way that he is faking here. He's not got some trick up his sleeve where he's trying to trick the people to make them think that somehow the fire came from heaven. If it's completely wet, there's no way that a human being can set it on fire. And so he's just building the case and making it stronger and stronger about who God is. And so in 36, it says, and at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Of course, Israel, Jacob, his name was changed to Israel after his wrestling with the angel in the latter parts of Genesis. And so he is addressing God in this way, but also he's calling the people's attention back to the God of their fathers, reminding them of their ancestral roots and their relationship with God. And so he says, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. And I have done all these things at your word. So God, first of all, vindicate yourself. Show them that you're God, not Baal. And then show them that I haven't been a fraud. I'm not making this up, that I'm speaking for you and that they can trust what I'm saying. And so verse 37, he says, answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. And so show yourself to be the only living God. Prove me to be your servant. And also do this to turn the people's hearts back to you. Let them see your greatness and let them be drawn into you yet again. So what happens, verse 38? Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering on the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. God sent down this fire, thought to be, some people think it's lightning. Either way, whatever it is, it's fire that God directs for this specifically, and it completely takes and consumes everything. Now, this is not an uncommon thing. In 2 Chronicles 7, in 1 Chronicles 21, in Leviticus chapter 9 and verse 24, God sends fire from heaven and consumes offerings. And so this is not an uncommon practice. This is not something that God has never done before. And so God here answers again the same way he's done many times. And the people respond. And when all the people saw it, verse 39, they fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal and let none of them escape. And they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. And so God proved himself, and the people had their hearts turned back to him. It seems as if they're penitent in this moment anyway. And we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 19. But he takes the prophets of Baal and he slaughters them by the brook Kishon. Now, some people think he does it in the brook Kishon so that their blood would be carried out to other lands outside of Israel. Whether that's true or not, that's certainly up for debate, but it's a thought that some people have. Now, other people are troubled by Elijah's slaughter of the prophets of Baal. But what we have to remember is that Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 11, the law had said that false prophets are to die. These ones intentionally deceiving the people, they're to die. When you go back to the Achan story, when you look at who was the real troubler of Israel, he was killed and his family. These prophets are troubling Israel. They're killed. Furthermore, it's about God exacting justice. What had Jezebel done to the prophets of the Lord? Well, he'd killed them. Only by the help of Obadiah had 100 of them survived. And so here is God avenging and executing justice on the prophets of Baal. So there it is, the showdown on the mountain. And now rain is going to return. So God has proven himself to be superior in every way, which of course we're not surprised. But when you look at 17, he's superior to Baal in the fact that he stops the rain. They think Baal gives rain, he stops it. He goes to Baal's home turf and provides things that Baal cannot provide. He goes to Baal's home turf and Mott, and he raises a child from the dead, proves himself to be greater than that. Then he shows here he's greater than Baal. He can respond even on Baal's perceived home turf. And you have to understand that they believed their gods were territorial. Gods did not cross borders. So here went the God of Israel on the turf of Baal and absolutely destroyed it. Now, one final statement made about and that shows God's superiority. Just as the stopping of rain showed God's superiority of Baal, now the commanding of rain will show God's superiority to Baal, because he's the one that's truly in control. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing of rain. Go get something to eat, because the rain is coming." Now, some people see this as a covenant meal. I don't see that yet. It could be, but I just don't see it yet. So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to Mount Carmel. And he bowed himself down to the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, "Go up now and look toward the sea." And he went up and looked and said, "There's nothing." And he said, "Go again 7 times. And at the 7th time, he said, "Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea." And he said, "Go up and say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you." And so he's been going, he's praying for the rain to return, in essence. And that's what you see spoken of in James chapter 5. He prayed that it might not rain. It didn't rain on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. Then he prayed again, and rain came upon the earth. And so this is the latter part of that. And so now he sends word to Ahab saying, "Get your chariot and don't let the rain stop you," because the Kishon would flood and would keep him from returning to Jezreel. And so what he's saying is quite significant. In a land that has not seen rain for more than 3 years, not only is it going to rain, it's going to rain so much, it's going to flood and keep you from getting home if you don't leave right now. Verse 45, and in a little while, the heavens grew black and the clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And in that is the final thing that God displays. The great rain now comes. God's victory over Baal. He has shown himself to be superior in every one of these things, but when you put them all together, this is just the final thing that just drives it home. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, most likely because Jezebel was there. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment and he ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. And so obviously this involves miraculous manifestations in some way. Elijah is able to run and to outrun Ahab, who is traveling by chariot, and beats him to Jezreel, where certainly was near to where Ahab had a palace. When you look at chapter 21, we'll run into that a little bit when we talk about Naboth's vineyard. Now, the question is, what has happened with Ahab here? So some people, when they look at this last paragraph, verses 41 through 46, they see it as Ahab has been penitent. That when Elijah runs ahead of him to meet him, they see that statement of Elijah running out before the chariot in a similar way of, say, David had a processional that would go before him. Kings had processionals that would go before him and lead the way, or a herald preparing the way in another illustration. And they see that Elijah doing this is Elijah saying that Ahab has repented, and now he and Elijah can actually work together to bring about this great restoration in Israel. That's certainly possible. I don't know. Or it could be that Ahab has zero intentions to repent. Either way, it does help us to understand in certain forms what's going to happen to Elijah in chapter 19. He's going to enter into great spiritual despair because he's won this great victory. God has shown himself to be great, and his emotions obviously had to be through the roof. I mean, he was so excited for what God had done and how God had shown himself, and to see the reaction of the people, and then to see what we're going to come to chapter 19 is, it doesn't really bring about a lot of change. And that is a really, really, really difficult pill to swallow. And but for now, things are looking good. Things are looking really good. The people of Israel seem to be turning back to God, and Elijah obviously is ecstatic. That's what he has wanted. That's why he's been preaching. And so God has proven himself to be superior. And that's what we should see when we look at the text. There's no God. It doesn't matter. Even though we don't have in America, we may not have gods that are idols that we put up in a certain place and we bow down and we worship to them and we offer animal sacrifices to them. But we certainly have our gods. But what we have to realize is that none of those gods are superior to the God of Israel. None of them even really exist. They're nothing. They're not even alive. And they can't give us. They can't do for us. They can't love us the way the God of heaven can. And so we rejoice in this manifestation where God proves himself to be the only living God, and we continue to live in light of that. And hopefully people are drawn into God and their hearts are turned back to God when they see what he is doing, the same way that the children of Israel were on this particular occasion.